Senator Rubio.
Thank you. I want to address head-on sort of this strain of thinking among some that our challenges with Russia are the result of something we did, that we offended them in some way, and if we were just nicer to them, Putin would be more cooperative. Perhaps you disagree. That's why I want to ask all three of you. You spent a lot of time on this. It's my view that, by and large, Putin wants to be a great global figure on top of sort of deep historical rationale for both Russian nationalism and sort of the trauma of losing its great power status at the end of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so the combination, and domestically too, by the way, being able to argue that he's an indispensable global leader and that Russia matters again allows him to paper over some of the other difficulties in Russian society and the like. And so the truth of the matter is that in Vladimir Putin's view of the world, he is in a direct geopolitical competition with the United States, and the only way he wins is if we lose. In essence, the only way he has more influence and power and is bigger and greater is if America has less. Is that an accurate assessment of what we're dealing with?
I think we can have an argument about whether NATO enlargement, what we did with Libya and all that contributed to Russia's alienation. But I'm not going to fight your basic point. We are where we are. And it's clear to me that Mr. Putin has rejected as a goal Russia's integration in what we would call the liberal world order. Indeed, I believe he's rejected what we would call the liberal world order. And he seeks a very different place for Russia. He seeks a very different world. And I think we have to see him in most situations now, not as a partner, but as someone who has a very different agenda, which is inconsistent with ours.
Well, I'm going to be in violent agreement with you. Putin caused this strategic mess that he's in and that we're in with him. We gave Russia every chance, President George H.W. Bush, President Clinton, in the 90s, with a lot of aid from the United States and a lot of friendship to see if democracy would work. We were right to expand NATO. The Russians didn't like it, but they didn't end the relationship over that. They ended it over the perception that the United States was supporting the Rose Revolution in Georgia and the Orange Revolution in Kiev back during the George W. Bush administration in which I served. I think that was the issue that turned Putin against us, but I don't blame us. I'm glad we supported those democratic efforts in Georgia and Ukraine. So now we're stuck in Putin's zero-sum world, as you say, Senator, and we have to compete, and we're a lot stronger. And we will emerge if we defend our allies in Eastern Europe, defend NATO enlargement. We will win this without a war because he's not going to attack NATO. At some point, he passes from the scene in the next decade or so. We just got to have the courage to stay with our policy of containment until that happens.
Could I respond briefly as well? There are those who say that what NATO and what the United States did in enlarging the alliance was provocative and is responsible for a lot of Putin's behavior. I really reject that completely because even though I think what NATO did was provocative in one respect, and that was it offered an alternative political approach for countries that wanted to become members of the alliance and wanted to move away from being controlled by the Soviet Union. For Putin, this was, I think, threatening. I think he understood, has always understood, that NATO is not the kind of alliance that will attack Russia. I don't think that he has any fear of NATO militarily, but he does fear that countries on Russia's border becoming liberal democracies, Western democracies, will present a model of governance that will threaten his power and his ability to sustain his control in Russia.
Well, just as a quick point I want to make, there's a lot of concern about adding countries could get us into a war. We have no obligation under the NATO treaty to come to the defense of an aggressor. The NATO treaty is, and our obligations are almost exclusively defensive in nature. Is that not correct?
That's how Article 5 is written. First of all, there's no obligation to do anything under Article 5. You have to assess what you want to do, but it's a defensive article. It's not an offensive article.
And then in that context about Putin in general, as we talked about the zero-sum game, he is, though, a cost-benefit analyzer. He makes decisions on the basis of, it's the reason why these influence campaigns have provided a benefit that exceeds the cost. Is there not then wisdom, for example, in putting in place, for example, a cost ahead of future interference to say, this is the price you will pay? Sanctions are one thing. You've already paid that price. Another thing is to say, this is what will happen, sanctions and otherwise, in the future if you do X, Y, or Z, so that he knows ahead of time what the price will be, and theoretically you would want, or in reality, you would want that price to be higher than the benefit he thinks he derives. Is there not wisdom in deterring a future influence campaign by putting in place predetermined penalties he knows he will pay, so he knows exactly what the price point is?
I think the answer to that is yes, in part because, let's be honest about the context he's making his decisions. He made a heavy investment in Ukraine. His cost benefit paid off. He made a heavy investment in Syria. His return on investment, we would all, if we did that on Wall Street, we would be extraordinarily happy. And his active measures in the various elections, again, have paid off. So he's taken 3 fairly big geopolitical risks, and all 3, I would say, his benefits have outweighed his costs. So in order to change that thinking, we have to persuade him that if he were to take another big risk again, this time there would be a different outcome. So it can't leave a lot of discretion, and quite possibly Congress will have to take the lead here, given the statements of this president about giving his views of Russia. And plus, I don't know, maybe you do, what he communicated in the one-on-one at Helsinki. So I think the more that we can be explicit about the cost, the more likely we are to deter.
Can I just say, Senator, the problem we've had since 2016 is we haven't been clear about what the penalty is or shall be. And so if part of the bill that you may be referring to, with the draft bill that I've read, would set out very clearly what the penalty is, Putin's a rational person. He's opportunistic but rational. He'll understand that those are going to be the penalties. We've got to make sure that he perceives that we're serious about it. So I do favor that kind of approach.